good morning to the audience and also good morning to the translators who will accompany us throughout this day. My name is Bettina Marx. I am director of the Heinrich Böll Foundation, a German political foundation linked with the Green Party. And we support this important conference by Muwatin. I want to welcome you to this fourth session of the conference. The title of the conference is "When Will the Smile Return to Our World?" In the last 2 days, we have heard already some attempts to answer this question, or maybe rather attempts to define why the smile is absent in the first place. And we also found out that even in the midst of a deadly pandemic and multiple crises shaking the world, some people are smiling nevertheless. Or as one of our eloquent speakers said, some are laughing all the way to the bank. And I believe that today we will hear much more about this topic, and we will even get closer to maybe an answer. Today, our session is named Current Reality and Requirements for Change. We have an all-male panel today, but since we had an all-female panel at the beginning, and since we have excellent speakers, we can tolerate that. And we look forward to hear the 3 interventions of such eminent scholars. I want to briefly introduce the 3 speakers to you now, one after the other. Our first contributor is Sami Khatib, a cultural theorist and philosopher. He taught at Freie Universität Berlin, at the Jan van Eyck Academy in Maastricht, the American University of Beirut, and the Akademie der Bildenden Künste in Vienna. And he's currently in Berlin, as we heard, and has a very interesting library behind him. So he will be our first speaker. He is author of the book Teleologie ohne Endzweck, a book on the German thinker Walter Benjamin. Dr. Khatib will speak to us about violence, capitalism, and the spectre of fascism. But before I give him the floor, I will also introduce the other speakers that will come after him. We have Haytham Manna, president of the Scandinavian Institute for Human Rights in Geneva. He studied medicine and social sciences and international law, and has more than 50 publications in various languages under his belt. He held several positions in international human rights organizations and is the founder of the QMH movement for the values of nonviolence, citizenship, and fundamental rights. Dr. Manna's lecture is entitled Civil Resistance and Nonviolence. And finally, last but not least, we will hear Adam Hanieh, faculty member in the Development Studies program at SOAS at the University of London. He taught at the Zayed University in the United Arab Emirates. His research interest includes the political economy of the Middle East, labor migration, the formation of classes and state in the Gulf countries, and Palestine, also a very current and interesting topic. And Dr. Hanieh will speak to us on the topic of Gulf capitalism and the changing global political economy. So we have before us 3 highly interesting interventions that we will listen to one after the other. Afterwards, we will enter the discussion with our listeners who are tuned in through YouTube and Facebook. I would like to ask you, gentlemen, to limit yourself to 20 to 25 minutes in order to have enough time for the discussion afterwards. So we will start with Dr. Sami. Please, Dr. Sami, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Danke, dear Bettina. Thank you everyone for having me. Shukran, Mudar, shukran, Joyce. Thank you, Birzeit University, for allowing me to speak at this exciting online conference. It's actually the first one that I do under Corona conditions fully online. So my paper is called Violence, Capitalism, and the Spectre of Fascism. It's rather, let's say, pessimist to counter a little bit the otherwise very joyful title of the conference. So before I'm getting into the details of the argument, let me start with a couple of antithetical or dialectical notions and observations before I could actually write this paper. First, of course, I cannot not comment on the beautiful title of this conference, When Will the Smile Return to Our World? What I find so peculiar here relates to the idea of return and its historical or maybe post-historical dimension. I definitely smiled when I read the program and I read Gilbert Achcar's title, where he asks back, but when was our world smiling? Indeed, this return of smiling and cheerfulness probably cannot be translated into a linear historical sequence. The world wasn't smiling in late capitalism, be it ruled with a fascist, neoliberal, or a combination fascist, neoliberal politics. So now, in late Corona capitalism, some of us might have a little bit more time, sure, because of less travels and less physical movements, happily sharing moments of Zoomed online presence. However, the capitalist economization of COVID-19 related risks and burdens has already reached the next stage. The precarious and racialized global working force is exposed to the virus much more than those members of the global middle and upper class who can afford a home office, an office like I have at the moment here. So maybe our world has to return to a past that never was, a past that never was in the first place, in order to smile again. In a note written in 1935, Walter Benjamin once proposed to counter what he called the beastly severity, seriousness of fascism with a cheerfulness, a Heiterkeit of communism. We are still waiting to arrive at such cheerfulness. Instead, we are facing here another round of what Marx in 1851 described as a passage from tragedy to farce. The repeating cycles of late capitalism, its naked violence and shameless ideologies are a farce on a post-historical scale, a farce that even the COVID-19 pandemic cannot turn into a historical tragedy with a human face. The senseless farce of late capitalism seems able to integrate and even economize the pandemic, so that once again we are repeating the mantra of what late cultural theorist Mark Fisher called capitalist realism. And you remember this formula, of course. He said, it is easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of global capitalism. Originally, actually, this dates back to Frederick Jameson. I'm only mentioning here one film example that explored the dystopian consequences of this worldview in an excellent and very precise manner. Some of you might know this film, of course, and Slavoj Žižek always refers to it. The film is called Children of Men from 2006. It's a dystopian science fiction action thriller directed by Alfonso Cuarón. The film takes place in the UK in 2027, but bears an uncanny resemblance to our today's world of 2020. Let me briefly recall the main plot of the film. Of course, the longer version you can find on Wikipedia, and definitely it's worth watching again these days. So in 2027, after 18 years of total human infertility and global depression, the world is on the brink of collapse and humanity faces extinction. The United Kingdom, one of the few nations with a functioning government, don't laugh here, is deluged by asylum seekers fleeing radiation and plague. In response, the UK has become a police state as the British Army rounds up and imprisons or executes immigrants. Theo Faron, a former activist turned cynical bureaucrat, is kidnapped by the Fishes, a militant immigrants' rights group. They are led by Theo's estranged wife, Julian Taylor, from whom he separated after their son's death during a 2008 flu pandemic. I won't go further into the details of that film, but of course you find a lot of echoes, reverberations of our today's situation. Also, the ironic reference to the UK is amazing if you compare it to today's politics, but I won't go into that. Why I'm interested in this film in regard to our conference theme and also my paper is clearly in showing what are the dangers of a fascist organized world in late capitalism, where pandemics and global migration are treated as a kind of backdrop for the normalization of a fascist police state, in which, here to quote Walter Benjamin again, the exception or state of emergency has become the rule. In his comment, Slavoj Žižek pointed us to one particular feature of the film that also introduces the theme of my talk. And I quote from an interview that Žižek gave on the occasion of this film. I think that this film gives the best diagnosis of the ideological despair of late capitalism, of a society without history, or to use another political term, biopolitics. The basic problem in this society, as depicted in the film, Children of Men, is literally biopolitics, how to generate or regulate life. But again, I think the crucial point is that this obvious fact shouldn't deceive us. The true despair is precisely that. All historical acts disappear, like all those classical statues that are there, but they are deprived of a world. They are totally meaningless. Because what does it mean to have a statue like one of Michelangelo? It only works if it signals a certain world. And when this world is lacking, it's nothing. It all depends on whether we have a world. And not having this world, here's the end of the quote, not having this world is what Žižek then calls the ideological despair of living in a post-historical capitalism. And I think this has to do with today's situation of a state response toward COVID-19 and what I earlier now called late Corona capitalism. And this brings me back to the title, Violence, Capitalism, and the Spectre of Fascism. Today, in late Corona capitalism, we live in an allegedly post-historical world, whereas earlier worldviews, and there are many, of course, you can think of Christian eschatology, Enlightenment moral teleology, or something like socio-scientific progress, be it liberal or social democratic, they all relied on the idea that there is such a thing as history. But after 1990 or 1989, you can say, when Francis Fukuyama's para-Hegelian thesis became the ruling ideology of the world, that we are living in an end of history, we only have a capitalist imaginary. And that relates back to this idea that we can imagine the end of the world, but we cannot imagine the world as without capitalism. And the capitalist world, the global world, then reveals itself as the world market, a dehistoricized world market. History has seemingly arrived at a global post-historical equilibrium, disturbed only by external frictions, tensions, and conflicts, which appear as manageable, at least in principle. And again, here you have the theme of the film, and maybe the theme of our world. external frictions generated from inside, but tensions, conflicts that seem external to the functioning of capitalism, be it COVID-19 or something of local conflicts or global streams of migration that can be managed and economized, of course, but something that should be understood, at least according to this ideology, as outside of the functioning of the global world market. And as a result, we can say that time, or the experience of time, is stripped of its historical dimension and just reduced to a marker of dehistoricized space. That's, of course, an old thesis, and I'm taking this from Fredric Jameson. He already said this in the 90s and in the mid-80s already. He called it the postmodern mode of spatialization, which is driven by the will to use and subject time to the service of space. And that the politics of space and how you regulate space has become kind of a neo-feudal approach to politics. And here are many themes I could go into, but I just remind ourselves, of course, in this conference, I don't have to do this. The regulation of space, of borders, of zones, and of land grabs is something that, according to Jameson, is the expression of this postmodern mode of living in a dehistoricized world where everything is about space, a capitalist space. And it is under these post-historical conditions that, and this is the thesis of this paper, that the repressed origin of capitalism returns. That is the violent integration and reintegration of places into the space of the capitalist world market. And this is what good old Marx called primitive accumulation, or actually in German he said ursprüngliche Akkumulation. We should translate it rather as original accumulation. The eternal recurrence of capitalism's primal scene, if you would like to use more psychoanalytic vocabulary. This origin, or Ursprung in German, actually which literally means primal leap, has to be repeated always anew in order to keep capitalism alive. So here repetition is not temporal, but spatial. It's the displacement of an origin, historically Europe, from one place to another. Hence, original accumulation, that is the violent separation of labor power from the means of production that allows for the extraction of abstract labor and surplus value, does not designate a primitive stage of capitalism that took place once upon a time. Rather, it is the origin and starting point of each stage of capitalist accumulation. Of course, it is true that the specifically capitalist separation took place, you can say, in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. It coincides with the age of colonization. The violent separation takes place in Europe as a kind of civil war. You can say the German Peasants' War in the 16th century, and also then the 30 Years' War are all part of these initial phase of establishing capitalism in Europe, and then externalizing it and globalizing it through the age of colonialism and imperialism. But if I take this thesis seriously of Fredric Jameson, then I can say that capitalism's primitive or original accumulation is not in safe historical distance. It is repeated in the dehistoricized space of the present. It's going on and on again, and this has to do with the lack, you can say, of the lack of history, the dehistoricization of space, which becomes a kind of a staging ground for new regimes of capitalist accumulation. Otherwise, capitalism would cease to exist. So according to this theory, capitalism is not an historical age that came upon being at a certain moment in time and then, maybe will be transformed into another stage. No, but it is a violent rupture that has to be restaged in its very original sin, if you want, original crime, as a primal sin, always and always again, in order to keep it in power. So today, according to this theory, we live in a world in which almost all of capitalism's earlier historical stages coexist next to each other. While the sides of slavery, and also so-called Manchester capitalism, and capitalized modes of feudalism are constantly restaged in segregated areas, the fantasy of a green capitalism with Google democracy or Zoom entertains debates on so-called immaterial labor. So you have it all together. The kind of fantasy of green capitalism, maybe a digital capitalism. Next door, you have a fence, a wall, a segregated area where you have early Manchester capitalism, or even worse. And it's really under these conditions that the prefix of notions like neo-colonialism or neo-imperialism have lost their historical significance. I mean, I already used late capitalism here, but maybe you can say that capitalism's pre, neo, and post, they coexist in space. And I think that the current situation we live in is an acceleration of these coexistence and segregation, which of course our digital technologies allow for. This kind of juxtaposition in space, where I can be in a completely different world, different place, but connected to my peers. Yet next to me, we can live in a dystopian world that might remind you of this film that I mentioned earlier, Children of Men. So in a rather non-polemical sense, the space of capitalism, the space of the capitalist global market, treats history or sizes history down to the functioning of a 3D printer. The fantasy that you can reproduce history in space, next to each other, juxtaposed. That's the flip side of imagining us as being post-historical. History is basically outsourced into the museum or into the archive, and we can reproduce, restage history in space, next to each other. The fantasy of the present as an on-demand co-presence thrives on the idea that space is ultimately manageable, or at least containable. Of course, this is something that stands at the core of the state-sponsored measures against the COVID-19 pandemic. In space, at least, it's manageable. We can take distance, 1.5 meters, and so on. We can do this. From this perspective, the dehistoricization of time and the spatialization of history becoming space, become legible as strategies to seal off the space of capital against attempts to break open its borders. It is very telling that the ongoing political economic crisis of global capitalist space appears as a battleground around borders. And of course, borders and sites of population, of closures, of raw materials and its extraction, and so on. Global power translates into the power to control the zones of exploitation of raw materials, the circulation of commodities, and the movement of human beings, i.e. biopolitics. Resource wars, trade wars, and what earlier in Europe was called refugee crisis, remember 2015, are mobile yet permanent battlegrounds of spatial governmentality. These struggles in and for space seem to have lost their historical significance. Co-presence in segregated spaces supersede historical temporal sequentiality. So it's not anymore one historical age after the other in time. No, different segregated spaces can actually have their different temporality, non-historical temporality, next to each other. Again, this is something beautifully shown in a terrifying manner in this film, where the hero in Children of Men walks through all these segregated areas of refugee camps, of poverty. Then you have the luxury building where the looted art, the art of earlier ages, the classics, of course, statues and so on, are all being shown, deprived of the history because they don't signal a world anymore. It's just looted and put together as something that the victors or the ruling class of this age can afford buying, but totally deprived of a world and the history of this world where these objects were coming from or stolen from. However, as gloomy as this diagnosis may sound, the contested space of capitalism is also the place of resistance. And here we re-enter a terrain of history, the terrain, the side of history, and maybe we call it historical materialist concept of historical time. Of course, that is something that can be linked to Walter Benjamin and mainly to my scholarship. Before I jump into this argument, I should actually make sure that we still have enough time. Like, we are around 18 minutes. Bettina, yeah? Okay, so then I will move on to the concluding passage. Benjamin's concept of historical time presents a counter model to salvage, to rescue the remnants of modernity's concept of history without repeating its postmodern or post-historical deadlocks. And those who are familiar with his thought know he had a kind of messianic version of historical materialism that conceived of history not as a linear sequence, but as a anachronic constellation of different fragments of time, enacted, yet given life to, and also of those moments that were lost in history, lost in class struggle, lost to those people, lost causes, and of defeated people. But these fragments of time, they are still alive in a kind of anachronic constellation. Sounds rather theological, I know, but Benjamin had a whole theory about that. So history is not anymore the progression in what he called homogeneous and empty time. Rather, history is incomplete in a radical sense. Its texture is woven of struggles and catastrophes and failures. Therefore, it can never be identical with itself. For Benjamin, time was not a transcendental form of empirical events, think of Kant, or a kind of a raw material that you could use for politics. No, time is historical time only because it is a discontinuous medium. It's non-identical, and it is always related to something other than itself. In other words, historical time is never closed. Historical time is open to something, to some kind of alterity. And of course, you can say there's some kind of messianic lining in this idea of historical time. If historical time is closed, then it's not historical anymore. Then you live in a post-historical space. Then you live in the world of Children of Men, or what our age gets closer and closer to. And you can say it's only this openness or lack, structural lack, something which is not here, something we are awaiting for, or something that opens the historical horizon, that gives us or provides an experience of presence. So if you live in a post-historical age, by contrast, then you also lose the present. And if you combine this theory of Benjamin, I mean, it was written around 1940, late 1930s, in dark ages during German fascism, the beginning of the Second World War. But if you take this theory and read it together with Frederick Jameson and others on capitalist spatialization, then you can see that what capitalist spatialization or capitalist realism or post-historical capitalism, whatever you may call it, can be read as strategies to seal off, to close, to undo these gaps in the ontology of capital time, to close, if you want, those messianic loopholes in time, and you do it through the control over space. So, because capitalism is always endangered by crises, right? By crises that pop up at certain places, and they, of course, endanger the homogenation and the translatability of one capitalist space into the other, of one market into the other. And so the spatialization of those risks can be done in a place, on the representation of this place. And you can say that this is a kind of a strategy to secure the wealth of postmodern nations. And of course, the obvious side of capitalist spatialization is real estate, real estate speculation, which in turn leads to housing crisis and so on, gentrification. You can also say occupation regime is another way of doing it, grabbing land, grabbing space, making it something that you can control, that goes along with enforced displacement of entire groups of people, and so on. It is a long list of political examples that you could list here, which give us an idea of what are contemporary sites of struggle for spaces in the market. So you can say that locality here functions as a site of resistance, sometimes at least, against this post-historical global space of capital. However, in the end, capitalism precisely works with the fantasy that it can do without proper or particular places altogether. I mean, the medium we are just using is one of those instantiations. You can say if financial capitalism, and the capitalism that we are used to, and its inherent digital technologies can flatten time to spatial co-presence, separated only by minimal temporal delays, caused by the physical limit of fiber optics, exactly the little delay of my voice and of my picture that you just see, then space becomes almost a kind of a speculative space, a kind of a fantastic space, something not bound anymore to place, to a particular space. Then you can say space becomes a marker of time, of a time that is an abstract time, which again would then be another tautological definition, because time and space would then be completely defined by each other and through each other, and then become tautological. I won't go into the intricacies of this argument and what we could say with Marx here, but only I will end on this note. In the end, you can say, of course, this fantasy never will work. Capitalism can never fully dehistoricize its own age. It can never fully spatialize its own historical trajectory. You can say it's almost impossible to do so. It will never catch up with its own mode of spatialization. There is something of a kind of a loophole in this kind of historical age, late Corona capitalism, whatever you want to call it, where we can already see that the end of capitalism and also the future of current real-time capitalism has already been annulled. There is no future of this form of social relation. There is already something that has happened before, but we are beginning to realize that it already has happened. Benjamin had a very prophetic formulation in the 1930s with which I will close. With the destabilization, it's a quote from 1935, with the destabilization of the market economy, we begin to recognize the monuments of the bourgeoisie as ruins, even before they have crumbled. And the monuments of current capitalism, its architectural, financial, and ecological wastelands are already ruins. They are dying. However, this time of dying takes time. On this note, I will rest my case, and I will thank you for your patience for this rather long and convoluted paper.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sami. You can see there are no more smiles. Everyone is so concentrated on what you were saying. Thanks a lot for these really very thoughtful intervention. And I think I will have to listen to it again afterwards because it was so full of interesting thoughts. So thanks a lot. I will give the floor now to our next speaker, Dr. Haytham Manna, to talk to us about civil resistance and nonviolence.
صباح الخير, good morning for all.
My intervention today will not be a theory of readings or readings as much as it is derivations based on personal and social experience that I lived myself. Issue of violence has been an issue, a strong issue for our generation, major part of which had to leave, study to join the Palestinian Fidaya action. The 1967 defeat, it was a defeat for the political ideologies carried by the previous generation, the Nasiri, Party, and the Soviet socialism. And we're divided between the radical Islamic and revolutionary Marxists as well. One of the major differences in the Marxism in the 70s among its founders and in the university and outside the university was the issue of revolutionary violence, same as the issue of jihad in the heart of crisis that the different political Islam faced, Islamic movements faced. Among the leftist students, we always saw the photographs of Guevara, Alto Comaras, Elmer, and the Arab Gulf Liberation Front and Oman, and the Iranian Khalq Fida'is, carrying all that romantic charge to polarize and attract the youth. Also, the dissatisfaction was clear among the youths of our age at that time, 15 to 18 years of age at that time, that dissatisfaction and dismay against major names such as Sheikh Mustafa Sibai and Mr. Isam al-Attar and Hassan al-Hudaybi. They were dissatisfied because of these people's position that was not firm on the issue of jihad. And nonetheless, these leftist groups did not succeed in attracting more than 20 students from the Syrian and Lebanese universities. and the Syrian authorities limited the activities of the Arab socialist organizations through court sentences to death that were implemented in 1975. And the major circles faced impossible conditions to go for violence to attract them. And I remember the different forms of struggle, how we placed impossible conditions for going for violence. That is, violence is allowed if under these conditions, these impossible conditions. This was the smart fatwa or opinion that allowed to attract the youths who were very enthusiastic to join the peaceful political and unionist action. At that time, the Islamic Brotherhood used to send their youth to the Fidai action in Lebanon and Iraq. And with regional support, they declared jihad in Syria to bring down the Nusayri regime there. And the catastrophes of 1978 and 1982 ended with the Hama massacre. Our generation was scattered between the prisons and diaspora, and the public understanding of violence became connected with the dictatorships and suffocation to the freedom. I personally turned to the human rights and research movement. My experience, legal experience, allowed me to visit different areas of armed conflict, such as from Kashmir to Peshawar, and the African, such as former Yugoslavia, and so forth. Nonetheless, I moved the countries where there were civil movements such as Polonia, Czechoslovakia, and Germany. In
1995, I launched what was called a Convent of Arn for human rights activists. And in it, I said, every struggler should say, I reject any, refuse to participate in any project of a racist, violent or discriminatory nature. Dozens of human rights organizations endorsed this convent in 1997. And since that time, when I began writing and researching of struggle with Munsaf and Marzouki, various peaceful and civil resistance writings. There is no doubt that the establishment and expansion of the State of Israel, which is based on the necessity of militarizing Israeli society and ensuring military superiority to control, has been a constant topic of discussion with the parties that adopted violence. And to avoid making the stick of Moses govern our perceptions and methods of struggle, we were constantly striving to activate and invent peaceful forms of struggle. No one can claim the militant virtue of violence in the battle of change, whether it is inside or outside borders and regions. Personally, I went with the late Abdurrahman Naimi to the 6th governorate in the southern Yemen then to give lectures after the intervention of the army of Shah in favor of Oman Sultani to defend Oman then, and to force the front to leave it. And they did, and they started addressing peaceful struggle. In all human experiences, actually, that we've lived in the past 30 years, violence has been a major cause of overall societal decline, because the word system is in stages of recess that we are witnessing, was characterized by direct or indirect control of the pace of violence in any conflict in the countries of the ocean. It practices various forms of violence inflicted on those who install it in the position of the enemy, whether the camp of evil included cultures and religions or gigantic state entities resorting to violence, be it military or economic, was the most important way to preserve what could be preserved for the one who is most in power. We began witnessing the spread of the phenomenon of military professionalism, private security companies, and the expansion of the so-called mercenaries. Indeed, as they say, we have a list of the forms of who can be called mercenaries, which yesterday was the liberal army that's now fighting in Libya, to Wagner, to other offshore Libyan forces. All these care and contributed and still contribute. And now we have in the Syrian lands, the number of those who come from private companies, U.S. private companies, exceed the in number those who come from the formal official U.S. Military. And this is when we now have fighters without borders. They imagine that bombing an embassy or kidnapping a journalist could shake this system, this world system, or that the alliance with it and working with it under its banner allows the possession of a small shop in a market that is exclusively owned by the arms lobbies, while the escalation of economic violence through process of multilateral sanctions and forms an official policy of the most powerful. This is direct violence is really costly there until this now, as we see all in military interventions. They weren't exercised except in exhausted countries that are exhausted socially, economically, and politically. And when they're not exhausted, then the cost is very high. So Kosovo, we had the example from Kosovo. And if we go into a military war, it's not supposed in our camp to have any deceased. So these strategies that can be implemented after the disfragmentation of former Yugoslavia and the exhaustion of all actors by violence that took the characters, chauvinist characteristic or nationalist characters and so on. Regretfully, whenever there are sanctions or violence, there are losses. As Miss Madeleine Albright would like to say, that are bigger than the anticipated results or even of the basic losses. In both cases, resort to violence on the part of the oppressor and the oppressed, destructive to the weaker components and the vulnerable people. I will not discuss or waste my time or yours in devising advanced violent methods that allow what some Syrians have called, or maybe clapped to violence in Syria, changing the balance of powers. We should change the balance of power in order to win our battle. We need to possess specific weapons and other slogans that are funny that we've seen at the end, the result, half of the Syrian society live as victims, about 500,000 victims. They live outside their houses, their villages in Syria or outside Syria. And more than 500,000 victims and about 2 million persons with permanent disability. Those people, did they think that this violence will do to what? These consequences of this, aren't these responsible? Just like the security forces that have selected or opted to go to violence over peace. So the question is on the national and international level. How can nonviolence and civil resistance be made a method of common international struggle of civil societies to confront what I call autoimmune deficiency in the countries of the periphery and the most vulnerable societies during the slow transformation process in the global order, which we are witnessing as its harbingers. It's not far. It's not far from the reality when we say that before 2050, this transformation will be in another scene, probably. The scene that we've lived for 500 years, I think it will be difficult to still exist after 30 years. On the national level, we desperately need to confront what I call this autoimmune deficiency of societies, which means collective participation in the cultural, societal, and developmental reconstruction. Based on a simple principle. It is that the prevailing system has confidence, even today, in its ability to draw societies to the playfield or ground in which they master and hold the keys for. And this we have witnessed in the Syrian example, from the formation of the so-called Friends of Syria in order to steal and in order and mobilization. So and in July, up till July, there were more than 2,000 people in these peaceful demonstrations. I might not have the time enough, so I will send to Muwatin a script about an overview about the resistance, the peace resistance in Syria from 2011 to 2020, and how the nations that acceptance over it was intimidating, because they were in fear that there will be a peaceful transformation in Syria, because this will give the experience to all nations of the region, especially east of the Mediterranean, to come to what it would be called the corn and medium systems that think that they can control and govern, but rather they govern their nations, but they are governed by a whole system that sucks its blood and uses and exploits it on a daily basis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Haytham. You are very generous with your time.
يعني حقيقة كنت شكرا كنت أعطيتنا يعني وقتا إضافيا ممكن أن نستكمل الآن.
Our last speaker is Dr. Adam Hanieh with the topic Gulf Capitalism and the Changing Global Political Economy. Please, Dr. Adam, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Bettina, and thank you to my other two speakers and everyone who could be here today, and also to Muwatin for convening this conference. What I want to do in this presentation is look at the Gulf states of the Middle East and their place in the global. I'm going to speak initially around what is the importance of oil and petrochemicals and how do Gulf states fit into the oil and petrochemical industry at the global level. Then I'm going to speak to what this pattern means for class and state formation in the Gulf region. And then finally, I'm going to turn to what this might mean for current trajectories, current politics at the level of the Middle East. I want to just begin, though, by echoing some of the conclusions that Sami pointed to in his talk around the nature of global capitalism, and in particular the world market, and the importance of seeing capitalism at that level of the world market. Because I think approaching the development of the Gulf and the place of the Gulf in this manner tells us something about the importance of oil and gas to global capitalism that goes beyond the kind of commodity fetishism that we see used to often understand the nature of these commodities. I'm talking here specifically about the idea of the rentier state. So I think if we start with this notion of the world market and the relentless accumulation of capital, the need for capital to speed up the turnover time of capital, the need for capital to internationalize, the associated sense of financialization that comes along with this, we can understand something about the importance of oil to global capitalism. Beginning in the early decades of the 20th century, oil began to supplant coal as the principal energy source for transport, manufacturing, and industrial production. Oil's greater energy efficiency and portability made it an ideal fuel for road vehicles, for airlines, for shipping. And this was essential not simply to new modes of civilian transport, but also to the war-making ability of states. So in this sense, we can see why it was that oil in the middle of the 20th century really came to underpin the expansion of the world market, the increasing turnover time of capital, speeding up of the turnover time of capital, and the internationalization of these global markets. Oil also formed the basic feedstock in the production of new commodities such as plastics, synthetic fibers, detergents, fertilizers, all of which were to become such a ubiquitous part of our daily life from the mid-20th century onwards. And as numerous authors have pointed out, for Western governments worried about the militancy of coal unions in the United States and Europe, oil was considered much more politically reliable because oil and gas could be extracted from outside of these geographical spaces. So this shift to an oil-centered global capitalism had enormous implications for the Middle East. By the mid-1960s, it was evident that the Gulf possessed huge supplies of relatively cheap and accessible oil and gas, and the region would be central to meeting the fast-growing international demand for these resources. And in the face of deep-rooted anti-colonial and revolutionary movements across other parts of the Middle East, the Gulf states emerged as a critical pillar of US power in the region from the mid-20th century onwards. And this was a relationship that was built on a simple understanding. The Gulf monarchies would guarantee overarching support to US foreign policy ambitions in the Middle East, including ensuring the steady flow of oil onto the world market and the underpinning of this very essential commodity to the nature of global capitalism. And in return, the United States would provide full political and military backing to the Gulf's ruling families. The essential features of this relationship remain in place today, and it's really, I think, important to see this in terms of understanding the politics of the region. However, the last decade has seen considerable change in world oil markets. Most notably, we've seen the rapid growth in North American oil production due to the development of non-conventional oil fields or shale fuel in the US and Canada. These are resources that are difficult and significantly more expensive to extract in comparison to conventional oil and gas. Of course, all of this brings with it, is central to understanding the nature of climate change and climate politics today. And as a result of the expansion of these non-conventional fossil fuels, the US has become became a net exporter of oil in early 2011, and actually overtook Saudi Arabia to become the world's largest producer in 2013. A position that it has maintained until this day. Nonetheless, the Gulf still holds a central place in the world's hydrocarbon markets because of its lower average cost of production relative to other countries. And in fact, in 2019, prior to the COVID pandemic, and I'm going to speak a little bit in a second about what COVID might mean for all of this, the Gulf's market share of global hydrocarbons, and I'm speaking here about the 6 states of the Gulf Cooperation Council, their market share of global hydrocarbons stood at just under 1/4 of the world's total. And in particular, Saudi Arabia, oil supplies are important to highlight because Saudi Arabia is a swing producer of oil, meaning that it is able to bring new supply onto the market cheaply and quickly, and thus holds significant sway over world oil prices. Now, I've spoken to now around oil and gas as commodities, but I want to switch now to another critical feature of the Gulf's place in the global and the world market, and that is what happens to the financial surpluses that the Gulf accumulates as a result of these hydrocarbon sales. These financial surpluses, what are sometimes called petrodollars or petrodollar recycling, return to the world market in geographically specific fashion. Through the latter part of the 20th century, the flows of Gulf petrodollars were closely bound up with the development of global financial markets. One early illustration of this, and it's one that I think doesn't get enough attention, is the emergence of the so-called euro markets. These are financial markets that developed in Europe through the late 1950s and 1960s, and which lay outside of the national regulatory system or outside of the jurisdiction of the national regulatory systems in place in the United States, UK, and other European states. They were largely exempt from taxation and other domestic financial restrictions. So again, this speaks to these kind of spaces that lay outside of the national that Sami spoke to, and the importance of these in the development of the world market. So following the nationalization of oil in the Gulf in the 1970s and the large increase in oil prices that ensued during that decade, deposits of Gulf petrodollars in Northern American and European banks that operated in these euro markets reached very high levels. So the financial surpluses accumulating in the Gulf flowed into these euro markets, into the North American and European banks located in these euro markets, and then were and served to significantly increase the capacity of international banks to lend to multinational firms, to governments, and to other states. And this actually was pivotal to the way that the Third World debt crisis unfolded through the 1980s, with Third World countries borrowing through these euro markets in order to meet their financial needs in the moment of this downturn of the 1980s. And today, the power of the City of London is a direct, in global financial markets, is a direct legacy of these euro markets. So the point I'm making here is that the way the global financial architecture developed was intimately linked to where Gulf financial surpluses went. In particular, they're recycling back into financial markets in Europe. And this is true today, and it's something I'm happy to talk more to perhaps in the discussion. But Gulf financial surpluses recirculate into international markets through other more indirect means. This includes the Gulf's purchase of foreign goods and services, and particularly here, important here, the way that the Gulf has become an important market for high-end engineering, infrastructure such as machinery and transport, construction services, again related to the changing nature of the built environment in the Gulf. Another major route of petrodollar recycling, of course, is the Gulf's purchase of military hardware and services, military services from countries such as the US, the UK, and France. Between 2015 and 2019, the Gulf states bought more than 1/5 of arms sold globally. It's a remarkable figure. It is with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar ranking as the world's first, 8th, and 10th largest arms importers. So we can see, again, this is another way that financial surpluses are recycled from the Gulf into major defense industries, capitalist industries located in the United States and Europe, in particular the UK and France and the European side. In fact, Saudi Arabia alone purchased 1/4 of total US arms exports between 2015 and 2019. And this is up from 7.4% between 2010 and 2014. So a significant increase in the purchase of military hardware by the Saudi state. Turning now to what this means for the Gulf, class and state formation in the Gulf. Since the early 2000s, basically from 2000 up to mid-2014, there was a near continuous increase in the price of oil over this period, peaking in mid-2014, despite some ups and downs associated with the 2008 global financial crisis. And this increase in the price of oil brought a massive expansion in the quantities of surplus capital held by both private and state-owned firms in the Gulf, headquartered in the Gulf. A conservative estimate puts the collective value of disposable wealth and foreign assets of GCC governments, sovereign wealth funds, and private Gulf firms and individuals as well over $6 trillion by 2016, a remarkable amount that had grown significantly since the early 2000s. Now, this circulation of financial surpluses into the Gulf, this surplus capital into the Gulf, has helped nurture the development of large capitalist conglomerates headquartered in states such as Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, and so forth. These conglomerates include both members of the ruling families of these states who operate in a private capacity, controlling significant economic activities, as well as influential private sector firms, often linked to merchant families from the early days of state formation in the Gulf itself. So these capitalist conglomerates are typically structured as holding groups with activities across a number of different sectors. So it may include, for example, real estate and construction, speaking again to the importance of the built environment. It includes, for example, retail, the right to import commodities into the Gulf region and then sell them in malls and shopping places and so forth. Again, deeply connected to the built environment and the nature of the urban space in these countries. It involves productive activities, including steel, aluminium, concrete, and of course it involves banking and finance. So the holding groups that are active across each of these different kinds of sectors that are closely linked to the state in the Gulf, but also include both ruling family members as well as private individuals operating as the ultimate owners of these large conglomerates. So supported by their relationship with the Gulf state, these business conglomerates have expanded their international reach notably over the last decade. Historically, investments by the Gulf internationally have focused largely on North America and Europe. But in the early 2000s, there was a significant increase in the volume of capital flows coming from the Gulf into the wider Middle East, into neighboring Arab states in particular. So this internationalization of Gulf capital into the wider Middle East occurred through a variety of different means, but it had a major impact on the structure of capital ownership in the Middle East itself. Okay, and I'm going to go through in a second some key sectors where we can understand the impact of this internationalization of Gulf capital on capitalism in the Middle East itself. But before I do that, I want to make one really critical point, and that is that the internationalization of Gulf capital into the wider Middle East was predicated upon structural adjustment policies implemented by Arab governments through the 1990s and 2000s. In particular, places such as Egypt, which really took, under Mubarak, which really took the lead in opening up to foreign direct investment, into liberalization. And as a result of these kind of opening up to the world market, Gulf firms became a prime beneficiary of the neoliberal turn in the Middle East throughout this period of the 2000s. So we have, on one hand, the deepening of neoliberalism in the Middle East region, and on the other hand, the internationalization of Gulf capital into neighboring Arab states since the beginning of the 2000s. So let's have a look very briefly at what this might mean for key sectors. Beginning, agricultural production and agribusiness. In this sector, Gulf firms have taken a significant role in nearby countries through the purchase of land, the control of agricultural supply chains, and investment in agribusiness firms. In Egypt, for example, close to half of the 31 food and agricultural companies listed on the Egyptian Stock Exchange are either controlled or have extensive ownership stakes held by Gulf firms. Okay, around 50% of the major agribusiness firms operating in Egypt and listed on the stock market are connected to the Gulf in some kind of way. We can see these patterns in other states, Jordan, Lebanon, and increasingly in places like Morocco, where Gulf firms have a major stake in both agricultural land as well as controlling agribusiness supply chains. Urban development, again, this is well known, and it's certainly the case in Palestine, as we know from Rawabi and other urban development schemes in Palestine. The nature of the Arab city, the trajectories, tempo, and forms of urban development are deeply bound up with the development of capitalism in the Gulf region. Between 2008 and 2017, nearly 40% of all large-scale real estate projects in Algeria, Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, Morocco, and Tunisia were owned, developed, or built by a GCC-based firm. Again, quite a remarkable figure, I think, in the sense that 40% of projects, these are mega projects worth more than $100 million, connected to Gulf-based developers, construction firms, real estate development firms. In Egypt and Jordan, more than 1/5 of all listed real estate firms are linked to the Gulf. And these firms make up more than 60% and 39% respectively for both Egypt and Jordan of market capitalization in the real estate sector. So again, the way that our Arab city, the way urban development takes place in the Middle East, deeply bound up with the internationalization of Gulf capital. Telecommunications sector, again, a critical sector globally. More than half of all mobile phone licenses, the right to operate mobile phone licenses across Arab countries are fully or partially owned by GCC-based telecoms and investors. Okay, this is really important. Telecommunications as a critical urban infrastructure. And it's not simply to do with the right to operate mobile phones, the internet, and so forth. It actually is deeply connected with the nature of the urban space. For example, the notion of smart cities, the notion of cities and that are fully connected to the internet, the notion of cities that are where surveillance and information control is embedded in the nature of urban design. Telecommunications firms take that in a really central way. Moving finally to banking and finance, GCC banks hold more than 50% of all non-state-owned bank assets in Jordan, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and Lebanon. Again, we can see the centrality of the banking and financial markets to the way that economic policy unfolds in these states. The Gulf financial institutions are really central to these institutions. In Jordan, 86% of bank assets in the country are linked to the Gulf. Again, a remarkable feature. Okay, I don't have too much time left, but I want to just switch to the final section of my presentation today, which is to look at what these patterns might mean for the current trajectories, the current politics of the region, particularly in this time of COVID and the crises that have been mentioned by both Sami and Haytham. Obviously, in the wake of the 2010 uprisings in Tunisia and then spreading across the rest of the region 2011 onwards, the Gulf states have taken a very pivotal position. And I would argue that this, the emergence of the Gulf as one of the main actors jockeying for power within the regional system is not simply a question of politics. It's certainly not a question of religion, but it is deeply bound up with the processes that I've described, because the economic nature, the economic influence of the Gulf in the Middle East region depends fundamentally also on the political structures that are in place, the kinds of state structures that have emerged post-2011 and that are still being jockeyed for, if you like, in places of conflict like Libya, Syria, and other places. So it is, I think, fundamentally related to that, to the political economy of the region, that we see the Gulf take such a major role in both the direct involvement in violent conflict in places like Syria, Libya, and Yemen, the backing of different armed forces and political factions and movements, but also the financial support that has been extended by the Gulf to the new governments that emerged post-2011. Principal, of course, to this is Egypt post-Mubarak. The Gulf funding of these kinds of states have been closely tied to the maintenance of standard neoliberal development models in the region, including the role of international financial institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank. In fact, I would argue that it would be impossible for the IMF and World Bank to have taken such a or renewed their presence in the region with such force post-2011 without the support of Gulf states and the kind of paving the way for the re-entry of these international financial institutions into the region in partnership with the Gulf. Now, throughout all of this, it's important to remember that there are both shared interests and intense rivalries between the various Gulf countries. While the Gulf Cooperation Council project, a regional integration project, provided a limited degree of economic and political unity in the Gulf, we've of course seen the emergence of sharp competition between different Gulf states, particularly Qatar and on one hand, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates on the other. From 2017 onwards. We, of course, also have the long-standing rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia that has been present since 1979, but really emerged with full force following the ascendancy of King Salman to the Saudi throne in 2015, and his appointment of Mohammed bin Salman as the Minister of Defense and Crown Prince in 2017. I wanted to speak a little bit to the war in Yemen, but I might leave that for discussion since we're running out of time. But I think this is really important to understand the war in Yemen, not simply as a rivalry with Iran, but also in a geopolitical context where Yemen itself is really important to the kind of trade routes and logistics routes in the Red Sea, through the Suez Canal into the Mediterranean. So I think we need to see the Saudi UAE intervention and catastrophic attack on Yemen as part of an attempt by these two Gulf states to dominate these new infrastructure routes that will be quite central to the global political economy moving forward. Just to wrap up, the onset, of course, of the COVID pandemic in 2020 adds a new dimension to many of the trends that I've raised. Most significant, of course, has been the huge drop in demand for oil and the drop in the oil price that occurred as a result of the contraction of economic activities as well as the global lockdowns. Now, this crash in oil prices has placed enormous pressure on Gulf governments, and the likelihood that prices will remain low for a considerable period of time. But it is interesting to note, I think, that despite the fact despite the fact of this drop in the price of oil, we can understand that there is, I think, a significant possibility that the Gulf states will actually emerge in a stronger position in global oil markets coming out of this crisis. The reason I say this is that Gulf states have utilized this moment to actually embark on a further buying spree globally, both in the region of the Middle East, but also in other international markets. They have bought up significant shares in other oil companies, European oil companies in particular, as well as other industries that have become distressed as a result of the economic contraction. So my point being is that we shouldn't see moments of crisis simply as being bad. They impact differentially, and it's quite possible, as we all know, moments of crisis end up being moments of opportunity for capital. And I think understanding the Gulf in this context is really important. The final thing I want to end with is the events of the last few weeks, which is, of course, the normalization of the UAE and Bahrain with Israel, the opening of open political and economic ties between the Gulf and the Israeli state. I think none of us here would think that this is something that could have happened without the approval of Saudi Arabia, and it's probably not too far away that Saudi Arabia will also follow the same route. I would just say, though, firstly, that these normalization patterns have become open, but they are not new. There has been deep coordination, both economic, political, and security coordination between some of the Gulf states and Israel for at least a decade, if not longer. But the fact that this has now become open, I think, is really important to note. I think this, again, to return to the global, reflects a longer-standing strategy of the United States. We shouldn't just see this as a Trump initiative. We need to remember one of the key elements of the Oslo Accords, as well as the aim of the Bush invasion in 2003 of Iraq, was this end to any kind, or opening up the normalization between Israel and other Arab states, in principally the Gulf. In 2003, the Bush administration announced the plan for a greater Middle East, which involved bilateral or a free trade area linking all of the states, including Israel and the Gulf, in a single free trade area. That did not come to fulfillment, but in many ways what we see today is perhaps presaging that outcome at the level of the regional scale. So I think this normalization under the auspices of the Trump administration reflects longer-standing US strategic goals in the region. But, and I'll end on this point, it also reflects the competition between or the relative decline of US power, the emergence of other rising powers such as China, and the attempt of the United States to really reassert its dominance in a region of enormous flux, given the crises, given the 2011 uprisings. And part of that is establishing this connection between Israel and the Gulf states as its principal pillars of power at the regional level. I'll end it there, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This was really very rich, and I think your intervention alone would give us now, we would need like 2 hours to discuss it, because there was so much in it. And I had the feeling that you had to restrain yourself also not to give us even more information and food for thought. So thanks a lot for the 3 panelists. We have already a few questions. We have some questions in English and some in Arabic. I would say that maybe we'll take like a few questions together and make a first round and then go into a second round, not in order not to have too many questions at one time, then it will be difficult to even remember the questions. So I will read the questions. There are some questions by Muda. Muda, do you want to maybe give them yourself, or shall I read them? What do you prefer?
No, go ahead. Don't give me special treatment.
Okay, great, good. So I will start with the question. We have a question to Sami. How does the coexistence of various stages of capitalism impact the possibilities of war and or of a return to classical colonial techniques? So can you keep this for a second? I will then go to some questions we have for Haytham. One question is, what does it take to transform violent reaction to violent coercion and assault on the people into non-violent action? And we have another question from the audience also to Haytham. What is the relationship between history, social structures, and models of political change? How can a society that has witnessed a long history of tyranny and oppression move towards utilizing peaceful political models of change? If we take a look at Algeria, violence was the method that brought liberation from colonization, while the case of Palestine demonstrates how peaceful negotiations led to the maintenance of the status quo. And I will add also one question that we got for Adam, and then I will let you answer, and then we can go into a second round. So the question to Adam would be, do you think that Palestinian bankers today have a vested interest in supporting the UAE Bahrain treaties with Israel? So maybe we start with you, Sami, because you were also the first one to speak.
Yes, thank you for this question, Muda. There is a lot to say, of course, in terms of what is our underlying concept of violence and what is our concept of history. In a way, you could say, when we refer to the return of classical colonial techniques, I could ask back and could say, have we ever been fully non-classically capitalist? Or have we always been stuck in a certain classical period of capitalism and its uneven and combined development? So in a way, we can say capitalism, we are never fully capitalist. We are never fully in a world that has established capitalism as a kind of a condition that applies to everyone, each and everyone in an equal way. No, capitalism is something of an uneven and combined development that is in becoming. So those stages, earlier stages, historical stages, never fully vanished in capitalism, and their return only seems to be a return because we still tend, at least I still tend to look at capitalism with a kind of normative teleology. Certain stages evolved in temporal sequence, whereas today it reveals itself that earlier stages are combined with more modern ones or postmodern ones are maybe more important than those stages that we maybe associate with modern Fordist capitalism of the Scandinavian or the German model, maybe the social welfare state and others. I think Adam's talk was a very great example of showing us how these different modes of capitalist accumulation regimes can be combined, where maybe, let's say, the most Fordist or what made the Fordist capitalist world economy running can be combined, on the dirtiest, of course, and the bloodiest, if you want oil and blood, is combined with the most immaterial representation of wealth, namely financial capitalism. So how these two things are in conjunction, therefore the possibilities of war are always there. It's just a question of what do you define as war. Class war, for sure, it can be a war within, or an external war where these inner, let's say, systemic violence is turned into exceptional violence outside. But the violence is there because the original primal scene of capitalism, original accumulation, tearing apart, destroying communities and separating, singling out, producing the means of production as separate from labor force is there. And this can be turned outside and also can be taken back. And the US at the moment is a great example of all those wars post 1990 and even before, now coming back home. They were exported and now they're on the brink of a civil war maybe. So it is definitely war and violence are possibilities, immanent possibilities of that, and increased likability of these wars when you have a conflict around borders and a world space, at the end of history, a world space of capitalism where it's only about place A against place B and so on. This is a different way of doing it than maybe in an earlier age. It's a long to say to this, but I will not take too much time.
Thank you. So I would move over to Dr. Haytham. I think this is also really connected to what Sami just said.
بالنسبة للسؤال إذا كان يتعلق
if it is related to our subject or to the Syrian situation, I think the question does not apply to the Syrian case. As for the Syrian case, we have lived what can be called organized crime and not reaction. It was not from the society. There were no violent reactions from the society. On the contrary, as Dr. Abdul Aziz Al-Khair, who is absented or detained, and Dr. Walid Al-Bunni also, who has been in detention for 8 years during Bashar's time, and myself, when we signed and worked on the document to leave this violence and international and sectarian triangle, the main subject was that there was a major group, a large group, working in a conspiracy, not against the Syrian regime, but against the Syrian civil movement and Syrian people. And how that happened? How did that happen? Very simply, we had a strong tendency, paid one, that the Libyan Interim Council paid first donation in Qatar to be something, and it was nothing, and names were not known. This tendency was a repetition for the Libyan model being the only one that can take place in Syria, otherwise the Syrian civil revolution will fail. Even people like Qaradawi or Araur started speaking about the good traits of the NATO and saying there's no solution but for the NATO to intervene. Arms were moved, and many people in the opposition, they said that I serve the interests of the regime when I said we were offered 3 shipments of arms. Those who accepted the shipments were the ones who started armed action, but they were not from the heart of the Syrian society that remained sustaining the peaceful nature of its movement. And the nation were very well aware of the risks of militarization. Our community is very militarized. In 2011, we had around 500,000. The military establishment and security establishment is the largest organized armed institution and apparatus. So the battle was with the largest institution, even more than the working class by 3 times or 3-folds. That's why the catastrophe is that the society was very well aware, but we had to face the different nations, and part of the Syrians who lost the 1982 battle and those who came from Afghanistan and from Europe, they came and want by any means to take power. We had that complex, the Syrian Brotherhood movement. They said, okay, Hamas was elected. In Egypt, they did. In Tunis, they did, except for us, the Islamic Brotherhood in Syria. So they said, we have to get the support even from the devil in order to bring our movement to power by making coalition with this or that parties. The Islamists played the game on behalf of the Islamic Western coalition. And this theory was proposed since August 2011. The problem that we use this term brainstorming a lot. The problem that we are living under the Bedouin brainstorming, if you wish. The Bedouin, like Hamad bin Jassim, thinks himself to be the smartest in the world and that is capable of ruling Syria, or maybe Bandar bin Sultan. They think themselves as big shots who can rule Syria. Even their performance in their country or the fortune is just coming by nature. It's from nature. They did nothing as their achievement. So in a situation like this, there was that support and tendency for support for all those who go for arming, especially if they call themselves as Islamic. Call yourselves as the lions of Sunnis or the Ahrar al-Sham, Islamic Ahrar al-Sham movement, then they got the support and the operation rooms. They had not a single Syrian, neither in the north or in Amman. But officers who called from different countries, calling themselves as brothers, friends of Syria. And all of them, they were supporting and arming the Islamic parties, but not a secular party. So in the Syrian experience, we were victims of organized violence by different international actors. From Turkey, we received 120,000 foreign jihadists. Imagine, not a single, not only one or two. The Italian red flags or banners were not that number. We are receiving here 150,000 to die and to go to heaven. This is what they wanted to do. That's why I don't believe that our communities, they don't have the awareness of the importance of non-violent struggle. An indication of that, proof. Now, in the South, there are assassinations and counter-assassinations. The security services assassinate and a small group counter-assassinate, but the major community is selected the non-violent struggles, such as protecting the civilians or popular committees or the assistance and relief committees in renovating schools and sustaining hospitals as functioning as much as possible. So here, there is awareness. It has been around, and it is there among some Islamists. So that we need the reformist Islamists, not the Brotherhood Islamists. That we need to stay within the civil resistance. Otherwise, we cannot compete with the regime in its own court that is violent without external intervention. That's why I always have that pain for this international agreement. The British and American and French ambassadors came from Geneva after the Geneva statement for political solution. And in the Syrian opposition conference in Cairo, we called to discuss that. So the British ambassador told me, we have moved to solution B, plan B. I asked him, how is that? He said, no, this does not suit us, the Geneva thing. We have a battle to bring down the regime. So these are things that we cannot forget, how the different nations, from the Bedouins to the major capitalist regime, which is the Syrian Premier and others, they agreed on the issue on selecting violence as a major factor in the events and to marginalize the civil action that have hundreds of thousands, so that these people either immigrate or drop political and civil action or activism and sit at home helpless. For us in the Syria case, this is what applies to us in response to Postmodern. As for the question that connects neoliberalism and with the issue of violence, I don't believe. Certainly there are different professors and others who write in revolutions.
In the Syrian experience, when we addressed them, we talked to them, we approached them in 2011, they said that's the first step, which means it's a step, not a strategy. That's why there's no connection between this and that. As for the example of the colonization, by the way, we have one colonized state or country, which is Palestine. And we make this 1 out of 21 a public thing. We did not. In our talk, it's not about to condemn or not to condemn systems and governing systems and the Palestinian authorities, but in general, even in Palestine, in the occupied Palestinian territories, if the second Intifada wasn't armed, I would see we can say that Satan's deeds wouldn't have gone far. That's why we don't want to be limited or restricted to being peaceful movements and then linked to certain currents. Just as happened like in white Russia the other day, because there not ready to go and manifest in other places. There's a big difference between these two approaches. We don't have no connection. We don't have any connection with these movements. And I reconfirm, based on the Palestinian cause, if we consider, as we do consider that the Palestinian cause is a central one in all dimensions, but we cannot make the models of Palestinian struggle models of struggle in the whole region. Otherwise, then the power will overrule. We in Syria we've lived this. So those who've been staying in 40 years in Kandil mountains were able to continue, and who had the officers of former Saddam Hussein former system were able to come up with ISIS, and those who have professional fighters who used to fight in Bosnia or in Algiers or in Afghanistan were able to make it and to maybe form a type of emirate. But those who are new in this fighting, sometimes they were like 3,800 parties. That this party could be formed of or comprised of 10 people, and they were just the victims of assassinations among each other. But I hope I've answered your questions.
Thank you. The last question was to Adam. So I will ask you now to answer this, and then I will go in one round if we have enough
أتمنى إنه
time.
يجاوبني وبعدها بنشوف إذا في بضل معنا وقت. السؤال كان حول كيف يندمج المصرفيين أو يتشابه
And I think it's really important to, in looking at this, to think about the nature of class formation in Palestine, in the West Bank in particular. And I think there's a very strong argument to be made to understanding the largest Palestinian capitalists as very much connected to capital accumulation in the Gulf. So I think this is a pattern we can find replicated among many diaspora bourgeoisies in the Middle East, in the sense that the Gulf became, because it was and is the center of accumulation in the Middle East, the Gulf also became very important to the accumulation of the largest bourgeoisies displaced through war and occupation and conflict over the decades. So we can see many of the big Palestinian capitalists, the Masri family, for example, is well known, but many others, who both hold citizenship in the Gulf, which is something very difficult to get, as well as obviously having business interests in the Gulf region itself, across all of the same sectors that I outlined in my presentation: construction, retail sectors, finance, banking, etc. So I think we need to see the Palestinian bourgeoisie as yes, Palestinian, but also at the same time as being part of the Gulf capitalist class to a significant degree, and certainly in terms of accumulation, having the Gulf region as a major focus of their activities, way more important than the West Bank in terms of these large business groups. So yes, objectively speaking, there is this kind of, I think, push, and this is, I think, historically can be seen in terms of the political orientation of this section of Palestinian capital to support the normalization with Israel. But on the other hand, there is, of course, the reality of the Palestinian movement, Palestinian rejection of this normalization process. So whether we see kind of an open move to support these kinds of treaties on behalf of Palestinian capital, I think objectively it's there, but there is this kind of political there are political reasons mitigating against that kind of orientation currently.
We actually came to the end of our time, but we have lots of more questions. So my question to Muda, can we take another 10 minutes and go into one more round of questions?
Yes, Bettina, I think there's a long break until the next session, so yeah.
Okay, good. So I will maybe start then with Adam, because you were the last one and can maybe just go on. We have more questions to you. So one question is, do you think that Palestinian, no, this one we already had, but there are two more. How do you see the future of oil-based Gulf wealth and capitalism, especially with the rise of hydraulic fracturing in Europe and North America, and the decreased reliance on oil from the Gulf? This is one. I have another one for you. What is the size and scope of Gulf investment in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip? And in what sectors are they concentrated? Could they be utilized to serve the normalization process? And then I have a last one to you, which comes from Anya Zorob, and she thanks you for your intriguing presentation. And she asks, where do you see possible dimensions for normalization to unfold in the future between the Gulf countries? What does this mean for Palestine? So these are the questions for you. I have another one to Sami from Wael on YouTube. What I draw from your talk is that we need to push against capitalist dehistorization. However, how can we avoid the, I don't exactly know what this word means. I think it's probably fetishization of history. So this would be a question to you. And we have another one from Ghassan Abdallah to Dr. Haytham. Why are we not witnessing the impact of peaceful protests such as the Yellow Vest movement and the Black Lives Matter in the US? So I would leave it here and ask you to respond maybe according to the order in which I read the questions. So we start with Adam and then Sami and then Haytham. Oh, you are muted, Adam. You are muted. Can you hear me? You're muted.
Sorry about that. So to begin, I'll run through the three questions. Firstly, the question around the importance of the rise of shale and other non-conventional oil and gas in the United States and in Canada. This had a big impact on the structure of the world oil market, as I pointed out in my presentation, in the sense that it pushed the US and Canada into the ranks of the world's largest producers. It vastly increased the quantity of carbon dioxide being released into the atmosphere, obviously. It also was dependent upon a high oil price, because this is much more expensive. These industries are much more expensive. So they are being reduced, if you like, or these non-conventional oil sources are being placed under immense pressures because of the current moment with the low oil price. Many of these firms in US and Canada are highly indebted, and there have been a big uptick in bankruptcies among these firms. So I think the Gulf's position importance will continue within these industries. There is, of course, the question of climate change and the shift away, or at least rhetorically, the talk by some of the big oil firms like BP in particular around moving away from oil and gas towards renewables, etc. I personally am highly skeptical of this talk by the big oil companies. I think, unfortunately, that they are not going to, that they are continue to be part of the problem, and they need to be dismantled if we are going to have any hope of preventing this kind of runaway climate change. So I'm very skeptical that what BP and others are saying, that they're intending to move towards renewables, is going to make a significant shift in terms of the makeup of oil or makeup of the energy mix and the centrality of oil and gas to global capitalism moving forward. As I tried to point out in my talk, these commodities are central to the way that capitalism emerged from the mid-20th century onwards, and I don't see any fundamental shift in their role. We need to see this beyond just the question of energy, but also the petrochemical commodities that we all of us consume to such a vast degree, as well as the financial, the relationship between oil and gas markets and financial markets, which remain quite integral. Gulf investment in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Yes, the same kinds of sectors that we see in other parts of the region. Real estate obviously is a big part of this. A lot of the development real estate projects in Ramallah are tied or connected to Gulf-based firms, whether it be directly through the Gulf or whether it be through these large Palestinian family groups that are connected to capital accumulation in the Gulf region. So real estate, banking and finance is very important, as well as the retail sectors, as well as telecommunications. Wataniya, of course, is the second mobile license is a Qatari Kuwaiti firm owned in that sense. The possible directions of normalization between Israel, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. I mean, I think this is going to move very quickly, and we already see like the trips back and forth. We see promises of joint investments. Some of the big Israeli banking groups have already visited the UAE, and UAE banks are saying they're going to set up branches and joint activities with Israeli banks. So I think that's going to move very quickly. I'm sure in the real estate sector we'll see similar things. I think one of the things, though, that we really need to keep, and this will not be as open and as public, is the question of security coordination and kind of surveillance technologies, which Israel is, of course, one of the leading sites globally for this kind of technology. But we also see in the UAE in particular a real ratcheting up of this kind of surveillance of populations and the embedding of surveillance technologies in urban infrastructures. And I think that's an area that's there has been talk and a lot of evidence saying Israel has had a close relationship in these technologies in the UAE for a number of years, but I think this is one area that will see greater coordination between these two states. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. So I will give the floor to Sami.
Yes, thank you. Wael's question was, how can we avoid the fetishization of history? Yes, this is a problem, the fetishization of history. Let's say history compartmentalized, or history turned into a commodity, or historical experience turned into a commodity that can be enjoyed in a history channel on internet, or in some event culture in a museum, or excavated in an archive and circulated, and it's cut off from the experience or the experiential space of a present. Exactly, this is the problem, and that is also the symptom of an age that experiences itself, its present, as post-historical or ahistorical. And these things go together, and I think to re-enter history is also to re-enter, to have a different concept of historical time. And I already tried very, very briefly in the paper to sketch out or to outline a different concept of historical time with Walter Benjamin and Marx, if you want, where we can allow for uneven and combined development, where we don't fall back into some Enlightenment concept of teleology or a religious idea of some eschatological end time or whatever, or salvation history or whatever. No, where history is something bound to non-identity and to openness, and where historical horizon is not defined by what is the spatial extension of the world market. So if you want to re-enter history, but also to have a different understanding of what is a global class struggle today that goes beyond the limit of economization of the commodity form. It goes towards non or post-capitalist forms of social relation. This would be history, but not going back to some history as we have it in the textbooks, and definitely not going into the temptation of turning history into commodity, in something that can give us certain experience, or something that we would like to experience as something to enhance our present modes of experience. Definitely not, because history is something we are not the sovereign master of. History makes us, and we make history, as Marx said, but not under self-chosen circumstances. We are called upon by history, and history points as us. We are not the ones who can situate us in a comfortable distance towards history. And therefore, I totally agree, we should avoid the fetishization of history as it is done today in many, many discourses. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Sami. And I, of course, always approve of spending time with Marx. I think it's a great idea. The questions that were posed to Dr. Haytham, I think he didn't understand them. We sent it to him. I cannot see him now. Here you are. Here you are. So I think you got the questions sent to you in Arabic and can respond to them also now. Thank you.
No problem.
لا مشكلة، أنا لم أسمعها. As for the organization that I call as global NGOs for Palestinian rights, their participation was effective and certain, and the anti-racism movement that started in the United States. I'll give example. And same thing at the movement of yellow vests. I myself participated in the yellow vest movement, and some of our youths participated in different areas. We were holding the Palestinian flag, and there was a sweeping support for that, and support by the participating groups. And they used to ask for copies of the Palestinian flag. As you know, the Zionist lobby accused the yellow vest movement as anti-Semitism, because they defended Palestinian leaders. On the other hand, as for the anti-racism movement that extended to Paris and Brussels and different cities, we see that the Palestinian life matters for me, the Palestinian rights matter for me, and different Palestinian flags were seen there. That is, we consider it as part of our struggle and part of the joint struggle and necessary cooperation between us as a non-violent movement from the East Mediterranean area. We live in these European countries, and we need to be part of, on the one hand, with the civil movements that develop and facing the existing system, and on the other hand, in combating or struggling for the joint objectives, such as the International Organization on Combating Apartheid, which was established by Dr. Rima Khalaf. We launched a number of sports and photographs, and they were carried by dozens of European and Arab activists and the demonstrations that were held there. I believe there is no follow-up maybe by some to the role played by the supporting organizations that support the Palestinian rights in these movements, peaceful movements.
We have a number of more questions, but I think it's already late, so I apologize for the people who asked the questions that we cannot go into another round. I want to, before I thank the panelists of today, I want to announce the last session of this conference, which will be tonight at 5 o'clock Jerusalem time. So this makes it 4 o'clock in Berlin, and then you have to connect yourself at what time you will tune in to listen. The session will be chaired by Jamil Salem. We will have as speakers Gilbert Achkar, who will speak to the topic, but when was our word smiling? Already Sami this morning referred to this title. And we will have Georges Ackermann speaking on the topic, the Arab world after the pandemic. And afterwards, to conclude the conference, we'll have a keynote address by Samuel Moyn, The Fall of Welfare and the Rise of Human Rights. So this will be the concluding session tonight. Please tune in and listen to it and enjoy it. I want to thank the distinguished speakers, panelists of today. Thank you very, very much for your interventions. It was really amazing. So much information in so little time, so much food for thought. I really think I have to move all of this again in my head. It was really amazing, and I wish we could have special sessions with each one of you, because you have so much to say and to contribute. So thanks a lot for these really, really very good and very deep thoughts that you shared with us. I want to thank also the two translators who accompanied us today and who will also be with us tonight, Mary Khouri and Maher Awadwe. Thank you very much for your translation. And of course, I want to thank also Muwatin, Muda and Joyce, who organized this and put a lot of thought into it, a lot of work into it to organize this conference. So thank you for all of you. Enjoy your meal or whatever you will rush to now. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much and hope to see you again.
Thank Mars.
Awesome.